Hi everybody, welcome to Dynamo Sword Channel. I'm David, and today on Dynamo Sword Channel, I will be reviewing the Windlass Classic Bastard Sword. This sword is an old discontinued model offered by Windlass years ago that has recently been reissued. So, how does this sword compare to the original model as well as other swords of its type on the market today? Well, stay tuned and we'll find out. The Windlass Classic Bastard Sword is a replica of later period war swords of the late 15th and 16th centuries. These swords were reminiscent of the earlier period war swords seen in the 13th and 14th centuries, such as the Oakshott Type 12A and 13A, with long, broad, parallel, cut-focused blades and two-handed grips. These were intimidating swords and a drastic change from the cut and thrust type long swords and hand and a half swords of the same time period. These swords are unique as many of them postdate the Oakshott typology, though much of the blades could or would fit in later blade types in the typology, such as the types 19, 20, and 22. As ballistics such as cannons and firearms became more prominent on the battlefield, armor became much more reduced in use. This saw a revival of the sword as a battlefield weapon, and as such, we start to see the use of larger two-handed war swords and even great swords such as the Zweihander, Claymore, and Flamebridge start seeing use in this time period. These swords were a true mesh of old and new, with many featuring older, cut-focused blade profiles, but featuring modern, intricate hilting, cross-sections, and ricasso. But some, like this model, featured simpler design, featuring guards and pommels with no intricate hilting such as ring guards and loop guards. Swords of this design seem to be most popular in both Southern Europe and the British Isles. This sword by Windlass has much in common with its historical brethren, featuring a broad parallel blade of hexagonal cross section, a ricasso, and deep fullering reaching 7/8 of the blade's length, and ending in a more spatulate tip, making this sword a sword with definite focus on cutting and the ability to deliver dismembering cuts. As mentioned earlier, these swords tend to postdate the Oakshott typology due to their later use in European warfare. But if I was to classify this sword by type, I would consider it a Type 20 due to the hexagonal cross section, ricasso, and broad parallel blade. The Type 20 swords were prominent in the 15th century and were the first showing of a resurgence of the war sword on the battlefield. Having broad parallel blades of hexagonal cross section, all of this type were two-handed or hand and a half swords. A unique trait of the Type 22 is its fullering, with almost all featuring three fullers, with many having two outer fullers reaching the length of the ricasso and a center fuller reaching anywhere from half to 3/4 of the blade's length. Sadly, these later period bastard swords were where we see the last use of the longsword and war sword types in Europe, as the swords use changed to favor the single-handed military and civilian rapier, as well as the great swords of the 16th and 17th centuries. Next, we'll look at the overall statistics of this sword. So its overall length is 44 inches. It has a weight of 3.5 pounds with a point of balance right at 4 5 4¼ inches from the hilt. The center of percussion is 21 inches from the hilt, and the class of sword would again be what is known as a war sword, or you could call it a later period bastard sword. So the overall blade length is 33¾ inches. The blade width at the ricasso is 1¾ inches, and that tapers to 1½ inches at the tip. The blade material is a 1065 high carbon steel, and it has a mirror polish for finish. The cross section is a flattened hexagonal, and it does feature a double fuller. The blade type again technically postdates the oakshot typology, but as we talked about earlier, you could classify this sword as a type 20 in the oakshot typology. So on to the guard. The guard's total length is 10 inches. The quillion dimensions at the base are 1/4 inch by 3/4 of an inch, and the quillions taper down to the tip where it's 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch. The material is a mild steel, and it has a more antiqued finish to contrast the blade. The guard itself, because of the sword, technically postdates the oakshot typology, but you can see simpler upcurved guards on other type 20s and things, so you could classify the guard as a style 1 with upturned quillions. The handle's total length is 7 inches. The original base circumference was 4 inches, and that swells to 4¼ inches at the ringlet, and then tapers down to 2¾ inches at the pommel. Now, I didn't really find the grip thickness comfortable, so I kind of wasted it down to more of an hourglass shape, and now the new circumference is 3¾ inches in this upper portion that I customized. The handle material is wood, and the original grip was a stitched black leather with the steel ringlet, as you see, and I simply kept the steel ringlet, which is fitted into the wood core, and wrapped a nice 1mm leather cord around the handle. Now, the pommel's total length is 2¼ inches. The pommel's circumference at the widest is 6 inches, and the material, like the guard, is a mild steel with an antique finish. The hilt construction is peened, and the pommel type would, as with the rest of the sword and the hilt in general, postdates the oakshot typology. More commonly, it appears like what is known as an onion bloom type that has been seen on swords of the 15th and 16th centuries, as far as arming and war swords like this. If I was going to classify it, it does resemble an oakshot type T3 or a type T in general due to its more scent stopper shape. But overall, either way you want to look at it, if you wanted to classify it, you could consider it a type T3, but generally it remains unclassified. Now, the scabbard is your standard windlass leather scabbard with steel throat and chape, as with most windlass swords. This one, unfortunately, as most of them, doesn't fit well, and there is no friction fit, and it slides easily when held upside down. The scabbard includes an additional belt frog button. As you see on some other swords, like their classic medieval sword, or even the Shrewsbury sword that I reviewed earlier on the channel. Overall, it's your standard windlass scabbard, that does good for housing the blade, especially if it's sharp, but not very attractive and doesn't really have much function due to its loose fit to the blade. Overall, for its price, it's a decent sword with a moderately attractive appearance. The blade is straight and the polish is even. The fullers terminate nicely, and the hexagonal cross section is definitely a nice touch in regards to historical accuracy. The ricasso is finished well and has a good transition point on the edge, though it does seem a tad out of place due to the fullers initiating above it rather than traditionally at the hilt. The guard is simple, up-curved, and strongly tapers at the quillion ends. It has an antique finish that darkens the steel, giving it a contrast to the blade, and it is fitted tight with no looseness and fits flush to the blade, though does have the usual windlass gap and, I don't know if you can see, but a little epoxy at the center to help obviously reinforce its sturdiness. The grip was a little bulky to my taste, but it is decently shaped, and it is accentuated by an upper ringlet at the guard, and of course the second ringlet 2/3 down the handle length. As was mentioned earlier, and I did customize the grip, as I did feel it was a bit too wide for my hands, and then of course the standard cheap black windlass leather with stitching. I definitely upgraded that with this nice cord wrap finish. The pommel is attractive and solid, and as I mentioned, it is peened to the tang and has a nice onion bloom design that was popular at the time. It is well cast, and in my opinion, definitely the most attractive part of this sword. Unfortunately, there was a few fit and finish errors to this sword when I received it. The first I experienced was in shipping, as one of the quillions was punched through the box and exposed. It got pretty marked up in the process, unfortunately. This was a surprise to me, as normally Windlass's packing goes above and beyond, but at the same time it makes me wonder why UPS, who shipped it, didn't simply push the quillion back in and tape the hole to stop more potential damage. Fortunately, the damage was minimal and only some light scratching occurred. The next issue was the actual pommel being loose. Now, this could have been from damage in shipping, as the package was obviously jostled enough to have the quillion punched through the box and shipping material, but its initial appearance did kind of show that the peening was just unfinished, as the peen itself was kind of up and wasn't meshed down onto the pommel. To remedy this, I repeened the pommel via hot painting with a mutual friend who has a forge, and the hilt has been very strong since. Regarding handling, the point of balance is low, but the overall weight of the sword and lack of distal taper make it feel heavy and cumbersome. It is manageable one-handed due to its blade length, but it is definitely more comfortable two-handed, as these swords were intended to be used. Overall, it is a decent sword, but its weight and handling leave much to be desired, and the cruder finish of the ricasso and the blade make it more or less attractive than it should be. As mentioned, this is a model originally offered by Windlass in the 90s during their collaboration with Del 10. Now, the first model had a shorter ricasso and better, fuller termination, as well as more attractive hilt furniture, making it a little more historically accurate to period originals, as well as just aesthetically pleasing for a buyer. In the early 2000s, when Windlass Steelcrafts acquired Museum Replicas, they released their own version of that sword, which is what this design you see today. Much like this reissue, the second version was considered heavy and the ricasso unattractive and ahistorical. One benefit of the reissue over the second version is the rigidity of the blade, as the originals were reported to be very whippy, as was known for windlass swords of that early 2000s period. A few other examples of later period bastard swords in the price range are the Hanwei Bastard Sword and Ronin Katana Euro model number 1. The Hanwei features a similar guard, but a disc pommel instead of the onion bloom type seen here. It also features a single fullered, more acute tapering blade and is generally longer overall in blade and grip length. The Ronin features a similar blade minus the ricasso, a more acute tip, and definitely more of a detailed hilt style. Unfortunately, I have no personal experience with either model, but comparatively, I would say either would be a better option than this model from Windlass, from reviews and statistics I've read about them. The Ronin is significantly more in price, but the Hanwei is actually less than the Windlass, giving it more accessibility to the budget buyer. Overall, I was a bit disappointed with the Classic Bastard Sword. Its overall clunky appearance, heavy handling, and fit and finish issues make this one a hard sword to recommend, especially with better later period war swords available on the market. If you can find this sword on one of Museum Replicas' Deal of the Day sales, it might be worth a purchase, but in the end, it is a rather disappointing sword that should have been improved with its reissue. I was hoping this would be the case, as it was with the Windlass Shrewsbury, but unfortunately, this sword doesn't have much going for it compared to other swords on the market. Well, I hope you enjoyed this review of the Windlass Classic Bastard Sword. Be sure to like and subscribe, as well as look forward to the cutting review with follow-up discussion. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.